The interstellar medium was not the empty void the terrestrial poets of old had imagined, but a pressurized sea of lethal radiation and screaming particles that only the most resilient organisms could navigate. Vahn, a biological entity whose lineage stretched back to the cooling of the first nebulae, adjusted the oscillating frequencies of the crystalline vessel with a series of rhythmic pulses against the sensory membrane. The ship was less a machine and than a grown extension of the Vahn consciousness, a translucent spire of solidified light that resonated with the harmonic vibrations of the local star system. They were currently surveying a minor rocky planet on the fringe of a spiral arm, a place characterized by its excessive gravity and its unstable, nitrogen-rich atmosphere. According to the Great Archive, this sector was supposed to be a graveyard of failed evolutionary experiments, yet the sensors were picking up a persistent, rhythmic interference that defied the natural entropy of the region. It was a jagged, discordant signal, lacking the elegant symmetry of the Vahn's own communications, yet it possessed a terrifying density of information. Vahn felt a tremor of unease ripple through their neural filaments as the crystalline hull translated the signal into a visual representation. It was not a song or a pattern of light, but a brutal mathematical sequence that described the structural integrity of carbon fiber composites and the explosive potential of refined chemical propellants. The source of the signal was a small, blunt object moving at velocities that seemed reckless for such a primitive design. It was a crude cylinder of metallic alloys, leaking heat and radiation like a wounded beast, yet it maintained a trajectory that was impossibly precise. As Vahn brought the crystalline spire closer, the magnification revealed the surface of the craft was covered in scratches and micro-impact craters, evidence of a journey through the debris-choked inner system. There were no elegant energy shields here, only the raw physical persistence of material science. This was the work of the species known in the older, darker corners of the archive as the terrestrials, a biological fluke that had emerged from a high-gravity well and refused to succumb to the crushing atmospheric pressure of their birth. The Vahn had long assumed the terrestrials had extinguished themselves in the fires of their own discovery, as most high-kinetic species did. To see one of their probes this far from the third planet was a breach of cosmic probability. Vahn initiated a deep scan protocol, sending a wave of subatomic particles through the metallic hull of the probe to map its interior. The results were baffling. Instead of the integrated neural lattices of a sentient pilot or the fluid state processors of a sophisticated automaton, the probe contained a series of physical switches, copper wiring, and a solid-state memory drive that relied on the movement of electrons through silicon. It was a mechanical clockwork heart beating in the dark, a testament to a species that solved the problem of the universe through sheer, stubborn manipulation of matter. As the scan deepened, Vahn discovered a small compartment containing a golden plate, etched with symbols that were almost insultingly simple. There were drawings of a bipedal form, a schematic of a solar system, and a series of binary pulses that indicated a fundamental understanding of hydrogen. It was a message sent into the dark by a creature that knew it was small, knew it was temporary, but refused to be ignored. Vahn felt a flicker of something the Vahn had not experienced in millennia: curiosity. The Vahn were the observers of the universe, the keepers of the slow, cold equilibrium. They existed in the gaps between heartbeats, watching the stars fade and the galaxies drift. To them, the terrestrials were a flicker of lightning in a summer storm, bright and destructive, and gone before the thunder could even be heard. Yet this probe had been traveling for centuries. It had survived the solar winds, the gravitational shears of the gas giants, and the abrasive dust of the Kuiper Belt. It was still functioning, still broadcasting its lonely, jagged sequence into the uncaring distance. Vahn decided to follow the trajectory back to its origin, a task that required a recalibration of the crystalline spire's propulsion. The Vahn moved by folding space, a graceful transition from one state of being to another. The terrestrials, it seemed, moved by pushing against the universe with explosions, a concept that was as fascinating as it was repulsive. The journey toward the inner system revealed the true scale of the terrestrials' tenacity. As Vahn bypassed the outer gas giants, the sensors detected a vast network of debris and discarded stages of ancient rockets. It was a trail of breadcrumbs made of discarded titanium and frozen fuel. The Vahn had never seen a species so willing to leave its waste behind as a monument to its progress. The third planet came into view, a vibrant sphere of blue and green wrapped in a swirling shroud of white clouds. It was beautiful in a chaotic and unrefined way, but it was also a fortress of gravity. For a creature born in the low-density environment of the Vahn homeworld, the thought of descending into that deep a gravity well was akin to stepping into a hydraulic press. Yet the terrestrials lived there. They thrived there. They built cities that scraped the sky and bored tunnels deep into the crust. Vahn moved the spire into a high orbit, cloaking the crystalline structure behind a screen of distorted light. Below, the planet was a riot of electronic noise. Thousands of satellites buzzed around the globe like angry insects, a chaotic swarm of communication and surveillance. The terrestrials were not a unified mind like the Vahn. They were a billion shouting voices, a cacophony of competing interests and contradictory goals. It was a wonder they had managed to launch a single probe, let alone create a civilization that could be seen from the stars. The scan of the surface revealed the sheer diversity of their industry. There were massive foundries where ores were melted into liquid fire, sprawling agricultural grids that reshaped the very face of the continents, and dense urban clusters that glowed like embers in the night. Vahn focused on a specific region near a large body of water, where the concentration of high-energy research was most intense. Here, the terrestrials were experimenting with the very fabric of reality, attempting to harness the power of the atom in ways that the Vahn had perfected eons ago. But where the Vahn used the atom with the delicacy of a sculptor, the terrestrials used it with the violence of a sledgehammer. They were building a gateway, a primitive attempt at a spatial fold. It was crude, dangerous, and likely to fail in a catastrophic release of energy, but the fact that they were trying at all was a revelation. They were a species that did not wait for the universe to grant them permission. They simply grabbed the laws of physics by the throat and shook them until they yielded. Vahn watched as a group of terrestrials, encased in bulky pressure suits, moved around the experimental reactor. They were slow and cumbersome, limited by the biology of their heavy world bodies, yet there was a deliberate precision in their movements. They were working in an environment that was fundamentally hostile to their existence, relying on thin layers of fabric and glass to keep the vacuum at bay. The more Vahn observed, the more the Vahn's ancient superiority began to feel like a thin veneer. The Vahn were old because they were careful. They were powerful because they were patient. The terrestrials were none of those things. They were reckless, impatient, and terrifyingly young. They were a species that had discovered the secret of fire and immediately decided to use it to reach the moon. Vahn realized that the probe they had found in the outer reaches was not a relic of a dead civilization, but a scout for an expanding one. The terrestrials were coming out into the dark, not as petitioners or students, but as explorers who expected the universe to accommodate them. The crystalline spire shivered as a burst of high-frequency radio waves washed over it. The terrestrials had detected something. Their primitive radar arrays were bouncing signals off the cloaking field, searching for the anomaly. They were blind, but they were reaching out with their hands, feeling for the shape of the intruder. Vahn felt a pulse of genuine alarm. If the terrestrials realized they were being watched, their reaction would not be one of awe or worship. It would be one of defensive aggression. They would see the Vahn not as gods, but as obstacles or, worse, as resources to be analyzed and harvested. The Vahn had a protocol for such encounters. Usually, it involved a quiet withdrawal and the marking of the system as a high-risk zone for future generations. But Vahn found themselves unable to disengage. There was something magnetic about the raw, unpolished energy of this world. It was a defiance of the natural order that the Vahn had spent their entire history upholding. The terrestrials were a chaotic variable in a calculated universe. As the experimental reactor on the surface began to pulse with a familiar, dangerous glow, Vahn realized that the terrestrials were about to make a mistake that would incinerate their entire research facility and perhaps a significant portion of the surrounding coastline. Their understanding of the spatial fold was incomplete. They were focusing on the energy required to tear the hole, but they were ignoring the tension of the surrounding space that would snap back like a broken spring. It was a flaw in their mathematics, a blind spot born of their linear perception of time. Vahn had a choice. They could allow the disaster to happen, which would likely set the terrestrial space program back by centuries, or they could intervene and reveal their presence. The Vahn ethics were clear on the matter of non-interference, yet Vahn felt the weight of the golden plate they had seen on the probe. "We are here," the plate had said. "We are trying." Vahn manipulated the crystalline lattice of the spire, projecting a localized dampening field toward the reactor on the surface. It was a subtle adjustment, a thinning of the spatial tension that would allow the terrestrials' energy burst to dissipate harmlessly into the upper atmosphere instead of collapsing inward. On the ground, the terrestrials would see it as a miraculous stabilization of their equipment, a fluke of luck that they would spend years trying to replicate. They would never know that a silent observer had reached down from the stars to steady their hand. The spire hummed as the energy was redirected, the crystalline walls glowing with a soft, amber light. For a moment, the connection between the ancient observer and the young, violent species was tangible. Vahn felt the heat of the planet's core, the salt of its oceans, and the frantic, pulsing heartbeat of the billions of lives below. It was an overwhelming influx of sensory data, a tidal wave of biological urgency that nearly drowned the Vahn's calm, analytical mind. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the reactor stabilized, the dampening field was withdrawn, and the connection severed. The terrestrials began to celebrate. Vahn watched through the sensors as the figures in the pressure suits embraced one another, their voices a confused jumble of joy and relief over the radio bands. They thought they had conquered a law of nature. They thought they were one step closer to the stars. Vahn felt a strange, melancholy satisfaction. By saving them, the Vahn had ensured that the terrestrials would continue their outward push, bringing their noise and their heat and their clumsy, beautiful machines into the quiet regions of the galaxy. The universe was about to get much more crowded and much more complicated. Vahn initiated the sequence to fold space, preparing to return to the Great Archive to report their findings. As the crystalline spire began to phase out of the physical dimension, Vahn took one last look at the blue planet. It was a small world, a fragile cradle of life in a vast and hostile expanse. But its inhabitants were not fragile. They were made of the same heavy elements as the stars they looked up at, and they possessed a spirit that was as dense and unyielding as the gravity that held them down. The Vahn would have to prepare. The terrestrials were coming, and they would not be satisfied with just a golden plate in the dark. The transition through folded space was a silent, instantaneous process that left Vahn with a lingering sense of displacement. The Great Archive awaited, a massive structure of thought and light that orbited a dead pulsar in the galactic core. There, the collective wisdom of the Vahn was stored in a lattice of quantum states, a library of everything that had ever been observed. Vahn knew that their report would cause a stir. The discovery of a high-gravity species capable of even primitive spatial manipulation was a theoretical impossibility that had now become a geopolitical reality. The Vahn had always considered themselves the stewards of the galaxy, the ones who maintained the balance. But how did one balance a species that thrived on imbalance? How did one manage a creature that saw every boundary as a challenge and every law of physics as a mere suggestion? Vahn began to compile the data, the images of the metallic probe, the scans of the sprawling cities, and the frantic energy of the reactor. They included the mathematical error the terrestrials had made and the intervention that had saved them. It was a confession as much as a report. As the data was integrated into the archive, Vahn felt the collective consciousness of the Vahn ripple with reaction. There were pulses of skepticism, waves of concern, and a distant, cold amusement. Most of the Vahn saw the terrestrials as a curiosity, a temporary anomaly that would eventually burn itself out. But Vahn could not shake the memory of the golden plate. It was the simplicity of it that was so haunting. In a universe of infinite complexity, the terrestrials had sent out a greeting that was as clear as a child's first words. They wanted to be known. They wanted to be found. And despite the vast gulf of time and technology that separated them, Vahn realized that they had found something in the terrestrials that the Vahn had long since lost. The willingness to be wrong, the courage to be vulnerable, and the sheer, magnificent audacity to look at the infinite and say, I am. The report was finished, the data locked into the eternal memory of the archive. Vahn withdrew their consciousness from the collective, seeking the quiet of their own internal reflections. The blue planet was far away now, a tiny speck in a distant arm of the galaxy, but for Vahn, the stars felt a little less cold and the dark a little less empty. The terrestrials were awake, and the universe would never be the same again. The transition from the serene, timeless vacuum of the great archive to the sensory bombardment of the terrestrial expansion was like plunging into a furnace. Vahn had been reassigned as a permanent observer, a role that required the deployment of a more specialized reconnaissance vessel. This craft was a splinter of obsidian glass, designed to mirror the background radiation of the cosmic microwave background, making it effectively invisible to the increasingly sophisticated detection arrays the humans were spreading across their solar system. It had been several decades since the intervention at the experimental reactor, and in that time, the terrestrials, who called themselves humans, had transformed their immediate neighborhood with a ferocity that bordered on the pathological. They had not merely reached their moon, they had scarred it with industrial colonies and turned its regolith into oxygen and glass. They had reached the fourth planet, a rusted desert, and were currently engaged in a violent struggle to force its atmosphere into a breathable state using massive orbital mirrors and subterranean nuclear detonations. Vahn watched the mirrors, each one the size of a small continent, as they unfurled like the wings of a predatory insect. The humans were not terraforming through the slow, biological processes the Vahn favored. They were terraforming through brute force and thermal trauma. They were rewriting the destiny of a planet because its current state was inconvenient to their ambitions. The obsidian glass splinter drifted past a massive construction lattice situated in the Lagrange point between the Earth and its moon. This was the centerpiece of their new age, a space elevator. It was a slender thread of carbon nanotubes anchored to a captured asteroid and tethered to the surface of the planet. It was a physical umbilical cord that bypassed the tyranny of the gravity well, allowing them to pour their industry into the vacuum with terrifying efficiency. Vahn marveled at the structural tension. To the Vahn, who moved through the curvature of space itself, such a structure was a primitive absurdity, a literal rope tied to a rock. Yet the humans climbed it with the relentless hunger of ants, carrying ton after ton of steel and silicon into the dark. The humans were no longer just a collection of competing nations. The shock of their successful spatial fold, which they still believed they had achieved through their own mathematical prowess, had catalyzed a global shift. They had formed a central coordinating body, though it was less a government and more a permanent war cabinet dedicated to the conquest of the physical universe. They called it the Terran hegemony, a name that carried a weight of territorial arrogance that made Vahn's neural filaments tingle with apprehension. The hegemony was not interested in the philosophical implications of space travel. They were interested in resources, in kinetic energy, and in the security of their species. They had begun to arm their vessels, not with the elegant energy projectors of the Vahn, but with massive electromagnetic rails that could accelerate slugs of tungsten to a significant fraction of the speed of light. They were preparing for a universe they assumed would be as hostile as the one they had climbed out of. They were building a fortress in the sky, and they were doing it with a speed that defied all Vahn models of civilization development. Vahn focused the sensors on a human vessel currently departing from the lunar shipyards. It was a massive, ugly thing, all exposed heat sinks and protruding sensor clusters. It was named the Indomitable, a word that Vahn found translated to a refusal to be defeated. The ship was powered by a fusion torch that left a wake of radioactive ions millions of kilometers long. It was loud, it was dirty, and it was fast. Inside the vessel, the humans lived in a state of constant, high-gravity acceleration, their bones and muscles reinforced by genetic therapy and synthetic implants. They were becoming something other than the creatures Vahn had first observed. They were adapting themselves to the machine, merging their biology with the steel and the silicon they had used to conquer their home. Vahn tracked the Indomitable as it performed a series of high-G maneuvers, testing the structural limits of its hull. The humans inside were subjected to pressures that would have liquefied a Vahn, yet they navigated the ship with a calm, practiced precision. They were at home in the violence of motion. As the Indomitable moved toward the outer rim, it passed close to the obsidian glass splinter. For a moment, a human pilot, encased in a liquid-filled acceleration suit, looked out through a reinforced viewing port. Vahn felt a surge of proximity. The human's eyes, magnified by the optics of the suit, seemed to scan the very patch of space where the Vahn observer was hidden. There was no recognition, of course. The human's technology was still too crude to pierce the Vahn's cloaking. But there was an intensity in that gaze, a searching hunger that suggested the human knew, on some instinctual level, that they were not alone. The Vahn had always believed that sentience was a product of equilibrium and contemplation. The humans were proving that sentience could also be a product of friction and desire. They did not want to understand the universe, they wanted to own it. This distinction was becoming increasingly important as the humans began to push toward the boundaries of their star system. The hegemony had recently authorized the construction of a second spatial fold generator, this one much larger and more stable than the prototype Vahn had assisted. They were planning a jump to the nearest star system, a binary pair that the Vahn had long ago designated as a sanctuary for delicate crystalline life forms. If the humans arrived there with their fusion torches and their tungsten rails, the devastation would be absolute. The Vahn High Council was currently debating the necessity of a blockade, a concept that was almost unheard of in their history. To blockade a species was to acknowledge them as a peer, or at least a threat. Many of the older Vahn still clung to the idea that the humans would eventually self-destruct, but Vahn's data suggested otherwise. The humans had survived their own nuclear age, their own ecological collapses, and their own internal wars. They were a species that had been forged in the fire of constant crisis. They did not break under pressure, they crystallized. Vahn decided to descend once more to the lunar surface, seeking a closer look at the heart of the hegemony's power. The moon was now a world of lights. The craters had been domed over, creating vast pressurized habitats where millions of humans lived and worked. The lunar economy was built on the extraction of helium-3 and the manufacturing of high-strength alloys in low gravity. It was a hive of activity, a frantic scramble for progress that never slept. Vahn moved the splinter into a low orbit over the Mare Tranquillitatis, where the first human landing had occurred centuries ago. The original landing site had been preserved as a museum, a tiny patch of grey dust and a spindly metallic ladder surrounded by a shimmering field of force. It was a sacred site to them, a reminder of the moment they had broken their earthly chains. Seeing it, Vahn felt a strange pang of empathy. The humans were so proud of that first, stumbling step, and yet they were already sprinting toward the edge of the galaxy. In the command center of the lunar capital, a massive underground complex carved into the basalt, the leaders of the hegemony were meeting. Vahn used the splinter's passive sensors to eavesdrop on their communications. They were not talking about peace or exploration. They were talking about the Fermi paradox, a concept Vahn found darkly humorous. They were wondering why the universe was so quiet, even as they filled it with their own noise. One of the humans, an older individual with skin like weathered parchment, was addressing a screen filled with orbital data. This human, a high-ranking strategist named Kalen, was arguing for a preemptive expansion. Kalen spoke of the Great Silence as a threat, a vacuum that would eventually be filled by something, and insisted that the something must be humanity. They were terrified of being found by something like themselves, a species that would see them as a resource or a rival. Their entire outward push was fueled by a deep-seated ancestral fear of the dark. This fear was the engine of their progress. It was what drove them to build ships that were faster than they needed to be and weapons that were more powerful than they could ever safely use. Vahn realized that the Vahn had made a fundamental error in their assessment of human nature. They had seen the humans' violence as a flaw, a remnant of their predatory past that would eventually be outgrown. But the violence was not a flaw, it was a tool. It was the same energy they used to split the atom and fold the space. It was the refusal to accept the limitations of their environment. If the Vahn tried to stop them, the humans would not see it as a lesson in cosmic ethics. They would see it as a declaration of war. And a war with a species that had spent its entire history fighting itself would be unlike anything the Vahn had ever experienced. The Vahn knew how to manipulate space and time, but they did not know how to fight. They had forgotten the meaning of the word. As Vahn monitored the Lunar Command Center, a new signal was detected. The second spatial fold generator, located on the far side of the moon, was being powered up for its maiden test. The energy readings were staggering. The humans had found a way to amplify the fold using a series of focused gravitational waves, a technique that even the Vahn considered advanced. They were taking a massive risk, essentially trying to punch a hole through the fabric of the universe using raw, unrefined power. If it worked, they would be able to reach the binary star system in a matter of hours. If it failed, they might create a localized singularity that would consume the moon and half the Earth. The humans in the command center knew the risks. They had calculated the probabilities, and they had decided that the potential reward outweighed the total annihilation of their species. It was a gamble of such staggering proportions that Vahn felt a chill through their neural core. The countdown began. All across the lunar surface, the lights dimmed as power was diverted to the generator. The space around the far side of the moon began to warp, the stars distorting into elongated streaks of light. Vahn moved the obsidian glass splinter closer, prepared to intervene if the spatial tension reached the breaking point again. But this time, the humans were more precise. They had learned from their previous luck. The spatial fold opened with a silent, blinding flash of Cherenkov radiation. For a split second, a bridge existed between 2 points in the galaxy, a tunnel through the higher dimensions. A small, unmanned probe was launched through the aperture, its sensors recording the first images of a new sun. The fold held for 3 seconds before collapsing in a controlled dissipation of energy. The command center erupted in a roar of sound that the sensors translated as a primal scream of triumph. They had done it. They had broken the speed of light. Vahn watched the celebration with a growing sense of inevitability. The humans were no longer confined to their cradle. They were no longer a local anomaly. They were a galactic event. The Vahn High Council would have to be informed that the time for observation was over. The humans had not just reached the stars, they had kicked the door down. As the obsidian glass splinter turned away from the moon and began its long journey back to the Great Archive, Vahn looked back at the space elevator, that slender thread of defiance stretching up into the black. It was no longer just a rope tied to a rock. It was a ladder, and the humans were climbing it with a hunger that would not be satisfied until they had reached the very top. The universe was quiet no longer. The humans were here, and they were bringing their fire with them. The report to the Vahn Council was met with a silence more profound than any Vahn had ever encountered. The data was undeniable. The humans had achieved spatial folding in less than 10,000 of their orbits, a fraction of the time it had taken the Vahn. The council members, beings of pure light and thought, pulsed with a slow, rhythmic apprehension. They questioned Vahn on the nature of the human spirit, trying to understand how a species so fragmented and violent could achieve such technical mastery. Vahn struggled to explain the concept of momentum, the way human progress was not a steady climb, but a series of explosive leaps fueled by the very crises that should have destroyed them. They were a species that thrived on the edge of catastrophe. To the Vahn, who valued stability and longevity above all else, the human existence seemed like a waking nightmare. Yet, the results were clear. The nightmare was expanding. One council member, a being of deep violet radiance known as Vahn, suggested that the Vahn should reveal themselves now before the humans moved any further. Vahn argued that the humans needed a shepherd, someone to guide their volatile energy into more constructive channels. But Vahn disagreed. They had seen the look in the eyes of the human pilot in the liquid suit. They had heard the roar of the Lunar Command Center. The humans did not want a shepherd. They had spent their history killing their own shepherds and tearing down their own gods. If the Vahn appeared to them now, they would be seen as the ultimate rivals, the ultimate challenge. The humans would unite against them, and their progress would accelerate even further. The only way to deal with the humans was to accept them as they were, a force of nature that could not be controlled, only navigated. The council reached no consensus, a rare failure of the Vahn collective mind. Instead, they authorized Vahn to continue the observation, but with a new mandate. They were to find the humans' keystone, the fundamental element of their psychology that allowed them to balance their destructive impulses with their creative genius. If the Vahn could understand that, perhaps they could find a way to coexist. Vahn accepted the task, though they felt a deep skepticism. They suspect there was no keystone, no single secret to the human success. It was the whole chaotic, contradictory mess of them that made them what they were. As Vahn prepared to return to the Terran sector, they felt a strange sense of anticipation. They were an observer, but they were no longer detached. They were invested in the fate of these heavy worlders, these climbers of the dark. The humans were about to take their second step into the galaxy, and Vahn wanted to be there to see where they landed. The obsidian glass splinter slipped back into the shadows of the solar system, arriving just as the Indomitable was being refitted for the first manned jump. The ship was no longer a lone vessel, it was the flagship of a fleet. 6 other ships, identical in their brutal, functional design, were being readied alongside it. They were the first generation of the Terran Interstellar Navy. They were not carrying scientists or diplomats, they were carrying soldiers, engineers, and colonial administrators. They were moving out in force, prepared to claim whatever they found on the other side of the fold. Vahn watched as the fleet formed a perfect geometric wedge, their fusion torches glowing like miniature suns. The humans were ready. They were moving with a purpose that was as terrifying as it was magnificent. The second chapter of their history was beginning, and the galaxy was the only stage large enough to hold it. Vahn settled into the darkness, the silent watcher of a species that was finally, irrevocably, on the move. The jump to the Alpha Centauri system was not the seamless, transcendent experience the humans had envisioned in their theoretical models. While the Vahn folded space with the elegance of a closing eyelid, the human method was a violent tearing of the local gravitational weave. Inside the obsidian glass splinter, Vahn monitored the transition of the Terran fleet as it punched through the aperture. The 7 vessels of the interstellar navy did not simply appear at their destination. They were vomited back into real space, their hulls glowing with the friction of multidimensional displacement and their crews reeling from the physiological trauma of a nonlinear transit. The Indomitable led the formation, its massive heat sinks struggling to shed the thermal energy accumulated during the fold. Around it, the 6 escort vessels stabilized their trajectories, their point defense turrets tracking frantically in the sudden, blinding light of the binary stars. They had arrived in the heart of a sanctuary, and they had done so with the subtlety of a kinetic bombardment. The binary system was a delicate equilibrium of orbital resonances, home to the Vahn, a substrain of the Vahn who had dedicated their existence to the cultivation of sentient crystals. These life forms, which grew in the low-gravity shadows of the system's asteroid belts, were sensitive to the slightest electromagnetic fluctuation. The arrival of the human fleet, with its leaking fusion cores and high-output radar sweeps, was a catastrophe. The Vahn observers, residing in their own translucent spires, were paralyzed by the sheer vulgarity of the intrusion. They had no weapons, no shields, and no concept of territorial defense. They had only the harmony of the stars, which the humans had just shattered. Vahn watched from the cloaked splinter as the human fleet began to deploy a network of sensor buoys, claiming the space around the primary jump point with a systematic efficiency that was chilling to behold. On the bridge of the Indomitable, the mood was not one of wonder, but of guarded suspicion. Strategist Kalen, now overseeing the expedition from a central command chair, watched the scrolling data on the holographic displays. The humans had detected the Vahn spires almost immediately. To their sensors, the crystalline structures appeared as anomalies, objects that did not conform to the expected spectral signatures of rock or ice. The human response was a perfect illustration of their fundamental nature. They did not attempt a broad-spectrum greeting. They did not transmit a message of peace. Instead, they moved into a defensive formation, painting the crystalline spires with targeting lasers to determine their density and composition. They were assessing the threat before they had even confirmed the presence of life. To them, the unknown was a target until proven otherwise. The Vahn finally managed a response, a low-frequency pulse of mathematical constants intended to establish a common linguistic foundation. It was a standard first contact protocol, refined over millions of years. However, the human systems, built for the high-speed processing of binary combat data, interpreted the pulse as a localized electromagnetic pulse intended to disable their electronics. The Indomitable responded with a warning shot, a single slug from its secondary railgun. The projectile, a 10-kilogram mass of tungsten, shattered one of the Vahn's smaller research outposts, turning a millennium of gathered wisdom into a cloud of sparkling dust. Vahn felt a ripple of horror through their neural lattice. The humans had just committed an act of interstellar war without even knowing what they were fighting. The violence was so casual, so reflexive, that it bypassed the Vahn's capacity for rationalization. The reaction from the Vahn collective was instantaneous and polarized. For the first time in an age, the High Council pulsed with the discordant colors of anger. The Vahn were a peaceful branch of their lineage, and their destruction was an affront to the cosmic order. Yet the Council remained hesitant. To strike back at the humans would be to descend to their level, to engage in the very cycle of kinetic destruction that the Vahn had spent their entire history avoiding. Vahn, watching the unfolding disaster from the obsidian splinter, realized that the humans were not acting out of malice, but out of a profound, existential terror. They were in a new system, surrounded by alien technology they did not understand, and they were reacting with the desperate aggression of a cornered animal. If the Vahn did not retaliate, the humans would likely continue to clear their surroundings until they felt secure. If the Vahn did retaliate, the humans would see it as justification for an all-out invasion. Vahn decided to take a desperate risk. They manipulated the splinter's communication array, intercepting the Vahns' next transmission before it could reach the human fleet. Vahn translated the complex crystalline harmonics into a crude, binary-encoded radio signal that the human computers could recognize. They formatted the message using the same symbols found on the golden plate of the ancient probe: the hydrogen atom, the bipedal figure, the map of the solar system. Then, they added a single new command in the humans' own military encryption: cease fire. The message hit the Indomitable's receivers like a physical blow. On the bridge, Kalen froze as the display screen flickered with images of their own ancient history. The humans had spent decades wondering if the probe had ever been found, and here, in a system light years from home, the universe was throwing their own words back at them. The tension on the bridge of the Indomitable was palpable. The human officers exchanged looks of confusion and dawning realization. They had been prepared to fight monsters. They were not prepared to be recognized. Kalen ordered a halt to all weapon systems, his voice a strained whisper that crackled through Vahn's sensors. For a long, breathless interval, the two civilizations stared at each other across the void, one made of light and memory, the other of steel and fire. The Vahn, sensing the change in the human posture, ceased their pulses and began to project a visual field of soft, amber light, a gesture of mourning for their shattered outpost. The humans, seeing the light, did not fire. Instead, they launched a shuttle, a small, pressurized craft that moved toward the largest of the Vahn spires with a tentative, almost reverent slowness. The meeting between the humans and the Vahn took place in the vacuum of a translucent courtyard beneath the light of the binary suns. The human representatives, still encased in their heavy, armored suits, stood before the shimmering forms of the Vahn. It was a collision of disparate realities. The humans were solid, rhythmic, and loud, their life support systems humming with mechanical urgency. The Vahn were ethereal, fluid, and silent, their thoughts resonating through the crystalline floor. Vahn observed the interaction through the splinter's optics, recording a moment that would change the trajectory of the galaxy. The humans did not apologize. They did not have the vocabulary for the magnitude of their error. Instead, they offered a gift, a small, sealed container of Earth from their home planet. To the Vahn, the gesture was baffling. The gift was a collection of minerals and biological waste, but they sensed the intent behind it. The humans were offering a part of their own physical reality as a pledge of presence. As the negotiations began, Vahn noticed a shift in the humans' behavior. The initial terror was being replaced by an intense, analytical curiosity. They were not looking at the Vahn as gods or even as friends. They were looking at them as a puzzle to be solved. They were already taking measurements of the crystalline structures, scanning the Vahn's light-based communication, and calculating the energy requirements of the Vahn's spatial stability fields. Even in the midst of a fragile peace, the human mind was looking for an advantage. They were a species that could not help but seek the leverage in any situation. This realization troubled Vahn more than the initial violence. A war could be ended with a treaty, but how did one end a fundamental drive to dominate? The humans were learning about the Vahn, and they were doing so with the efficiency of a predator learning the habits of its prey. The peace held, but it was a cold, brittle thing. The hegemony established a permanent base in the system, a massive orbital station they named Frontier. They did not leave the Vahn to their solitude. They surrounded them with a network of surveillance and trade. The humans wanted the Vahn's knowledge of spatial folding, and they were willing to trade their own advances in material science to get it. The Vahn, fascinated by the humans' ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level, began an exchange that the High Council viewed with increasing alarm. The Vahn were the keepers of the spirit, but the humans were the masters of the atom. By combining the two, the humans were creating a hybrid technology that was neither purely biological nor purely mechanical. They were building ships that used crystalline lattices to stabilize their fusion torches, and weapons that used folded space to deliver kinetic slugs. Vahn reported these developments to the archive, but the response was no longer a unified pulse. The Vahn were beginning to fragment. Some were horrified by the contamination of their culture, while others were secretly drawn to the humans' raw, kinetic energy. There was a vitality in the human expansion that the Vahn had not felt in millions of years. The humans were not just surviving, they were evolving at an accelerated rate, driven by the friction of their contact with an alien civilization. They were no longer the simple bipedal forms on the golden plate. They were becoming a galactic power, a heavy-worlder empire that was expanding its reach with every passing year. They had already identified 3 other nearby systems for colonization, and their shipyards back in the Terran sector were working at a capacity that was statistically impossible for their population size. The humans were also beginning to question the nature of the great silence they had encountered. They had found the Vahn, but they were now asking why they hadn't found anyone else. Their strategists, including Kalen, were developing a theory of the filter, the idea that most civilizations reached a point where they either destroyed themselves or were destroyed by a superior force. They were convinced that the Vahn were the exception, not the rule, and that the rest of the galaxy was a graveyard waiting to be picked over. This perspective made them even more aggressive in their expansion. They were not just exploring, they were scavenging. They were claiming every resource, every habitable moon, and every strategic jump point, convinced that if they did not take it, someone else, something else, would. Vahn watched as the first human colony ship arrived at a world orbiting the second star of the binary system. The planet was a frozen rock, devoid of life, but the humans did not see a wasteland. They saw a construction site. Within months, they had landed massive terraforming units that began to churn the crust, releasing gases and generating heat. They were literally building a world to suit their needs, ignoring the natural millions of years cycle of planetary evolution. They moved with a terrifying momentum, a collective force that seemed to gain strength from every obstacle it encountered. Vahn realized that the Vahn's mistake had been to think of the humans as individuals. Individually, they were small and temporary. Collectively, they were a singular, unstoppable process. They were the tide, and the rest of the galaxy was the shore. As Chapter 3 of their interstellar journey drew to a close, the humans had firmly established themselves as a regional power. They had a foothold in 2 star systems, a growing navy of hybrid vessels, and a burgeoning trade relationship with a branch of the Vahn. But the peace was an illusion. In the shadows of the frontier station, the hegemony was already planning for the next leap. They were looking toward the galactic center, toward the great archive itself. They did not know what it was, but they could see the massive energy signatures and the distortion of spacetime around the pulsar. To them, it was the ultimate prize, the heart of the great silence. Vahn felt a deep, resonant dread. The humans were no longer content with the fringe. They were heading for the core, and they were bringing their fire, their steel, and their unyielding will with them. The Vahn would have to decide, and soon, whether to welcome them or to try and extinguish the flame before it consumed everything. The obsidian glass splinter remained in orbit around the binary stars, a silent witness to the humans' transformation. Vahn watched as Kalen stood on the observation deck of the Frontier, looking out at the sprawling shipyards and the flickering lights of the new colony. The human looked older, his skin even more like parchment, but his eyes were filled with a cold, clear light. He was not looking at what they had built. He was looking at what was still left to conquer. He was a creature of the climb, and he would never stop. Vahn sent the final data packet of the cycle to the archive, a warning that was also an epitaph for the old universe. The age of equilibrium was over. The age of momentum had begun, and in the heart of that momentum, the humans were laughing, their voices a discordant, beautiful roar that echoed through the empty spaces between the stars. The expansion toward the galactic core was not a journey of discovery, but a coordinated military migration. The Terran hegemony had transitioned into a state of total mobilization, where every kilojoule of energy produced by their Dyson swarms was funneled into the construction of the Great Fleet. Vahn, still positioned within the obsidian glass splinter, trailed the vanguard of this armada. It was a terrifying sight. The humans had abandoned the aesthetic of their early, clumsy cylinders in favor of massive, slab-sided dreadnoughts that resembled jagged shards of a shattered world. These ships were no longer mere vessels. They were mobile industrial complexes, capable of stripping an asteroid of its minerals while maintaining a constant acceleration that defied the Vahn's understanding of inertial dampers. The flagship of this new era was the Apex, a vessel so large it possessed its own measurable gravitational pull, warping the light of passing stars as it tore through the fabric of space. Inside the Apex, the atmosphere was one of clinical aggression. The high-ranking strategists, now led by a successor to the aging Kalen named Vahn, moved through holographic command rooms where the galaxy was laid out as a series of tactical objectives. Vahn was a product of the second generation of interstellar humans, a being whose biology had been heavily modified for high-gravity environments and rapid neural processing. To Vahn, the Vahn were not a source of wisdom, but a biological inefficiency that occupied strategic space. The hegemony had long ago decoded the fundamental principles of the Oruvan's crystalline technology and had integrated it with their own nuclear kinetic systems. The result was a hybrid physics that allowed the Apex to fold space with a violence that left permanent scars on the local topology, spatial bruises that the Vahn considered a desecration of the universe's geometry. The Great Archive, the crown jewel of Vahn civilization, sat at the center of a web of stable wormholes, protected by a series of gravitational shunts and light-pressure fields. It had stood for 10 million years, a monument to the slow, careful gathering of knowledge. To the Vahn, it was the only thing in the universe that was truly permanent. But as the human fleet approached the outer perimeter of the archive's influence, the Vahn High Council realized that their permanence was a delusion. The humans did not seek to enter the archive and learn, they sought to secure it. They viewed the archive as a massive repository of potential weaponization, a treasure trove of technical data that would ensure their dominance over all other biological life. The Vahn's pacifism, once their greatest strength, had become their most glaring vulnerability. Vahn monitored the communications between the Apex and the archive's defense nodes. The Vahn sent out pulses of high-concept logic, attempting to explain the danger of disrupting the archive's delicate quantum state. They spoke of the entropy of information and the sanctity of the cosmic record. The humans responded with a list of coordinates and a demand for total transparency. Vahn's voice, transmitted across the void, was devoid of the awe that had characterized the first contact. He spoke with the cold clarity of a man who had calculated the cost of the universe and found it wanting. He informed the Vahn that any attempt to obstruct the Great Fleet's passage would be met with neutralization. It was a word that the Vahn language struggled to translate, as the concept of intentional, total erasure was alien to their philosophy. The conflict began not with a shot, but with a collision of wills. The Vahn activated their gravitational shunts, creating a wall of distorted space that should have sent the human fleet spinning into the void. But the humans had anticipated this. They launched thousands of gravity anchors, dense masses of degenerate matter that stabilized the space around their ships, allowing them to plow through the shunts like icebreakers through a frozen sea. The sheer physical grit of the human technology overwhelmed the elegance of the Vahn's manipulations. The Apex led the charge, its frontal shields glowing a fierce, radioactive violet as it absorbed the energy of the Vahn's defensive arrays. The Vahn, seeing their most advanced physics ignored by the brute persistence of the humans, felt a collective wave of existential dread. In the midst of the chaos, Vahn made a choice that would mark them as a traitor to their kind. They realized that if the humans reached the archive in their current state of aggressive paranoia, they would accidentally trigger the archive's self-destruct mechanism, a failsafe designed to prevent the collapse of the galactic core in the event of a catastrophic data breach. The humans did not understand that the archive was not a computer. It was a living, sentient entity that required a specific harmonic resonance to remain stable. Vahn decloaked the obsidian glass splinter, appearing directly in the path of the apex. It was a tiny, fragile speck against the mountain of steel and fire, but its signature was unmistakable. It was the mark of the observer who had saved them once before. Vahn ordered the fleet to halt. The holographic displays on the bridge of the apex flickered as Vahn bypassed the ship's firewalls, projecting a direct neural link into Vahn's mind. Vahn did not use words or logic. They used the raw, unfiltered sensory data of the archive's true nature. They showed Vahn the millions of years of history, the faces of species that had long since passed into dust, and the delicate, crystalline heart of the pulsar that powered the whole system. They showed him that the archive was not a weapon, but a memory. And they showed him that the human's fire, if unleashed here, would not just destroy the Vahn, it would erase the memory of everyone who had ever lived, including the humans themselves. For a long, agonizing moment, the Apex's railguns remained charged, the tungsten slugs ready to be accelerated into the heart of the archive. Vahn stood motionless in the center of the bridge, his neural implants smoking from the intensity of the Vahn's projection. He saw the golden plate of the ancient probe, the one that Vahn had found so many years ago. He saw the bipedal figure and the simple hydrogen atom. He realized that the archive was the only place in the universe where that plate and the spirit of the creatures who sent it would truly live forever. The humans' drive for momentum had brought them to the edge of the ultimate cliff, and for the first time in their history, they chose to step back. Vahn ordered the Great Fleet to stand down. He initiated a high-level diplomatic frequency, not a demand for surrender, but a request for dialogue. The Vahn, shaken to their core, accepted. The siege of the archive ended not with a victory or a defeat, but with a realization of mutual fragility. The humans were the masters of motion, and the Vahn were the masters of memory. Without the Vahn, the humans would eventually lose themselves in the void, forgetting where they had come from and why they had started their journey. Without the humans, the Vahn would have simply faded into the silence, a library with no one to read its books. The resulting treaty, known as the Accord of the Core, established a joint stewardship of the archive. The humans would provide the physical security and the industrial support to maintain the structure, while the Vahn would continue to curate the history of the galaxy. It was an uneasy alliance, built on a foundation of mutual suspicion and fundamental biological difference, but it was a peace. The humans began to build a new kind of station around the pulsar, one that was not a fortress or a mine, but a bridge. They called it common ground. It was a place where the heavy worlders and the beings of light could meet and exchange ideas, a melting pot of kinetic energy and contemplative wisdom. Vahn returned to the archive, but they did not go back to being a detached observer. They became the first of the Vahn to live among the humans, residing in a specialized chamber on common ground. They watched as the human children, born in the low gravity of the station, played with the crystalline drones of the Vahn. They watched as the human engineers worked alongside the Vahn scholars to repair the damage caused by the Great Fleet's arrival. The universe was still a dangerous, chaotic place, and the humans were still a volatile, aggressive species, but they were no longer alone in the dark. They had found someone who could remember them, and in doing so, they had found a reason to stay. The fourth chapter of the human story ended with a moment of quiet reflection. Vahn, now an elder statesman of the hegemony, sat on the observation deck of common ground, looking out at the archive. He was no longer looking for something to conquer. He was looking at a legacy. He turned to Vahn, who was hovering nearby in a shimmer of amber light. "We were always afraid of the silence," Vahn said, his voice a low rumble. "We thought we had to scream to be heard. But you were listening all along." Vahn pulsed a soft, rhythmic response. The humans had brought their fire to the heart of the galaxy, and instead of burning it down, they had used it to light the lamps. The great archive was safe, and the journey toward the next horizon was about to begin. The established peace of the Accord of the Core did not mean the cessation of human momentum. Rather, it signaled a redirection of that energy into a more complex, integrated form of expansion. The Terran hegemony had evolved into the Terran-Varnic assemblage, a political and biological entity that defied the traditional classifications of the Great Archive. Humans were no longer just the inhabitants of heavy world colonies. They were becoming a nomadic species of the high vacuum, their bodies reinforced by carbon silicate lattices and their minds interfaced with the quantum state processors they had co-developed with the Vahn. Vahn, still residing on the common ground station, observed the emergence of this new hybrid culture with a mixture of awe and trepidation. The humans had taken the Vahn's understanding of spatial harmony and used it to create the slipstream, a network of stable, artificial gravity wells that allowed for instantaneous travel between the stars without the violent tearing of space that had characterized their earlier jumps. This era was marked by the construction of the Great Ring, a megastructure that encircled the pulsar at the galactic core. The ring was a collaborative masterpiece, combining human structural engineering with Vahn light matter synthesis. It served as a habitat, a laboratory, and a diplomatic hub for thousands of species that were now emerging from the shadows of the Great Silence, drawn by the beacon of the archive and the stability provided by the assemblage. Among these species were the Rule, gaseous entities from the atmospheres of superjovians, and the Kith, subterranean hive minds that communicated through seismic vibrations. The humans, once the most aggressive predators in the sector, had unexpectedly become the galaxy's primary administrators. Their innate talent for logistics and their historical experience with managing competing interests made them uniquely suited to the role of mediators in a crowded universe. Vahn's successor, a woman named Sura who had been born on a lunar colony and educated in the crystalline halls of the Vahn, oversaw the integration of the Rule into the assemblage. Sura was the embodiment of the new humanity. She spoke in the rhythmic pulses of the Vahn as easily as she spoke the blunt, technical dialects of the hegemony. She understood that the strength of the assemblage lay not in its military might, but in its ability to absorb and utilize the diverse strengths of its member species. Under her leadership, the humans had transitioned from conquerors to architects of a galactic civilization. They were no longer trying to fill the silence with their own noise. They were creating a symphony where every voice had a place. However, this newfound stability was threatened by a discovery made at the very edge of the observable universe. Vahn was the first to analyze the data from the deep space arrays. A series of anomalies had been detected in the Virgo supercluster, vast regions of space where the stars were simply vanishing. This was not the result of natural stellar evolution or the formation of black holes. It was a systematic, deliberate erasure of matter on a galactic scale. The archive had no record of such a phenomenon, and the Vahn collective mind pulsed with a primal, ancient fear. Something was coming from the void beyond the galaxies, a force that did not operate on the principles of light or gravity. The assemblage called this threat the Void Eaters, a name that reflected the human tendency to personify even the most abstract dangers. Unlike the Vahn, who saw the erasure as a cosmic inevitability, the humans immediately began to calculate a defense. The humans did not wait for the threat to arrive at their doorstep. Sura authorized the mobilization of the Project Threshold, a massive undertaking that involved the construction of a spatial barrier across the entire galactic rim. This was a project of such staggering scale that it required the total cooperation of every species in the assemblage. The Vahn provided the theoretical framework for the barrier, a localized freezing of space-time, while the humans provided the industrial capacity to build the thousands of anchor stations required to maintain it. It was the ultimate test of the human spirit. A species that had once fought for every scrap of land on a single planet was now working to wall off the entire galaxy. They were no longer just protecting themselves, they were protecting the very concept of existence. As the anchor stations were deployed, the first of the Void Eaters reached the outer fringes of the Milky Way. They were not ships or biological entities, but ripples of non-existence, anti-information that unmade everything it touched. When a ripple hit a star system, the planets did not explode. They simply ceased to have ever been. The Vahn observers were paralyzed by the philosophical horror of it, but the human crews on the anchor stations responded with a grim, practiced defiance. They tuned their gravity anchors to the exact frequency of the ripples, creating a solid wall of space that the non-existence could not penetrate. It was a battle of fundamental physics, fought with a precision that left no room for error. The humans were holding the line against the end of the universe, and they were doing it with the same stubbornness they had shown when they first climbed out of their gravity well. Vahn watched from the Great Ring as the data from the front lines poured in. The human-led fleets were engaged in a desperate struggle to keep the anchor stations operational under the pressure of the Void Eaters. Many ships were lost, disappearing into the non-existence in the blink of an eye. Yet the humans did not retreat. They developed new tactics on the fly, using the Vahn's light matter to create decoy systems that lured the ripples away from populated sectors. They were learning the language of the void, translating the unmaking of reality into a series of engineering problems that could be solved. Their momentum had found its ultimate challenge, and instead of breaking, they were accelerating. They were becoming the guardians of the light, the only thing standing between the archive and the total erasure of history. In the midst of the crisis, a group of human scientists working in the subterranean labs of the Great Ring made a breakthrough. They discovered that the Void Eaters were not an external enemy, but a symptom of the universe's own aging process, a localized collapse of the laws of physics that had been accelerated by the very spatial folds the Vahn and humans had been using for millennia. The galaxy was not being attacked. It was being reclaimed by the entropy it had tried to outrun. This realization was a devastating blow to the Vahn, who had always believed their technology was in harmony with the cosmos, but the humans took the news with a strange, dark humor. If we broke it, Sura said during a council meeting. Then we're the only ones who know how to fix it. The human solution was as audacious as it was dangerous. They proposed to reboot the local laws of physics within the boundaries of the spatial barrier, using the energy of the pulsar at the galactic core to trigger a controlled, localized Big Bang. This would create a pocket universe within the Milky Way, one where the laws of entropy were reset and the Void Eaters could not enter. It was an act of supreme arrogance, the creation of a new reality to replace the old one, but it was the only way to ensure the survival of the archive and the species within it. The Vahn were horrified by the idea of abandoning the original universe, but the humans argued that the universe was not a place, but the people and the memories within it. The archive was the heart of their world, and they would move heaven and earth to keep it beating. The preparations for the Genesis Pulse began. Every member of the assemblage was moved toward the core, seeking refuge within the Great Ring. The archive was prepared for a total data transfer into the new reality, a process that required the Vahn to undergo a final, irrevocable transformation into pure information. The humans, too, prepared for the transition, knowing that their physical forms would be forever changed by the reset of the physical constants. Vahn stood with Sura on the observation deck as the pulsar began to glow with a light that had never been seen before. The Void Eaters were pressing against the spatial barrier, their ripples of non-existence tearing at the edges of the galaxy. The time for the old universe was over. "Are you afraid?" Vahn asked, the amber light of their form flickering with the intensity of the moment. Sura looked out at the encroaching dark, her hand resting on the cold steel of the railing. "We've been afraid since the first time we looked at the stars and realized how big they were," she said. "But we've never let that stop us. We're climbers, Vahn. If this mountain is ending, we'll just have to build a new one." The Genesis Pulse was triggered. A wave of creative energy, a literal new beginning, erupted from the pulsar, washing over the Great Ring and the archive. The spatial barrier held for one final second before the entire galaxy was folded into the new reality, leaving the Void Eaters behind in the empty, dying husk of the old universe. The fifth chapter of the story closed on a world that was both familiar and entirely new. The Milky Way was now a self-contained sanctuary, a jewel of light in a dead cosmos. The humans and the Vahn had survived, but they were no longer the species they had been. They were something integrated, something more resilient. They had faced the end of everything and had chosen to start again. As the new stars began to form in the reset space, Vahn looked at the golden plate, which had been the first piece of data transferred into the new archive. The bipedal figure and the hydrogen atom were still there, a reminder of the small, violent creatures who had refused to go quietly into the night. The humans had not just survived the silence, they had rewritten the laws of the universe to ensure they would never have to hear it again. The birth of the second galaxy was not a loud event, but a profound, shimmering expansion of potential that redefined the very nature of existence for the survivors of the assemblage. In this reset reality, the physical constants were subtly tuned to favor stability over entropy, a gift from the Vahn's ancient mathematics and the human's desperate necessity. The Great Ring now orbited a rejuvenated star that pulsed with a steady, life-giving warmth, and the Great Archive had been integrated into the very fabric of the new spacetime, making knowledge as accessible as light. Vahn, now existing as a hybrid entity of luminous thought and reinforced neural architecture, walked the terraces of the ring alongside Sura, who had undergone a similar transcendence. They were the custodians of a new beginning, the witnesses to a species that had finally transitioned from the era of momentum to the era of mastery. The humans of this age were no longer defined by their heavy world origins. They were beings of pure agency, capable of shaping the matter of the new galaxy with the same ease as they had once shaped clay. The cities on the Great Ring were no longer industrial hives of steel and glass, but gardens of integrated technology where biological and artificial life lived in a state of perfect resonance. The humans had not lost their drive, but it had been refined into a pursuit of complexity and beauty. They spent their centuries exploring the nuances of the new physics, creating art that spanned entire star systems and music that resonated through the gravitational waves of the core. The old fears of the Great Silence and the Void Eaters had become legends, bedtime stories told to children who would never know the terror of a dying universe. Yet, even in this utopia, the human spirit retained its fundamental trait, the need for a horizon. As the second galaxy reached its maturity, the inhabitants of the ring began to look outward once more, not at the dead husk of the old universe, but at the infinite possibilities of the multiverse that lay beyond their sanctuary. Sura and Vahn stood at the apex of the ring, a point where the boundaries of the pocket universe were thinnest. They were looking at the great membrane, the shimmering interface between their reality and the infinite sea of potential that existed outside. The humans had already begun to develop the technology to bridge this gap, not with the violent folds of their past, but with a gentle, harmonic resonance that would allow them to step between realities as easily as they had once stepped between planets. They were no longer running from anything, they were moving toward everything. Sura, her eyes reflecting the light of 1,000 new suns, turned to Vahn. She spoke not through sound, but through a direct communion of intent that bridged their two heritages. She suggested that their journey was not a circle, but an ascending spiral, and that every end they had encountered was merely a threshold to a more magnificent beginning. The decision was made to launch a new probe, a vessel that would carry the legacy of the assemblage into the multiverse. This was not a metallic cylinder or a crystalline spire, but a vessel of pure information, a thought seed that contained the entire contents of the Great Archive and the collective consciousness of the species within it. It was the ultimate refinement of the golden plate, a message that did not just say, "We are here," but "We have become." Vahn felt a deep sense of completion as they helped to calibrate the seed's frequency. They remembered the first time they had seen the humans' crude probe in the outer reaches of a minor star system, a lonely object leaking radiation into the dark. That moment of curiosity had led to the salvation of the galaxy and the birth of a new reality. The humans had been a chaotic variable, a dangerous spark, but they had also been the only ones with the courage to keep the fire burning when the universe went cold. As the thought seed was launched, it did not accelerate through space. It simply faded into the membrane, its signature harmonizing with the infinite. It was a gift from the second galaxy to the rest of existence, a blueprint for how to survive the end of time. The humans and the Vahn watched it go, a silent pulse of amber light that carried the weight of their combined history. They knew that somewhere, in another reality, another version of Vahn might find it and wonder at the audacity of the creatures who sent it. The cycle of discovery would begin again, but this time, the message would be one of triumph rather than survival. The assemblage had reached the final horizon, and they had found that it was not a wall, but an open door. The final days of the Great Ring were spent in a state of tranquil preparation. The inhabitants were not fading away, but were preparing for their own transition into the thought seed's path, a collective migration into the infinite. Sura and Vahn were the last to remain on the observation deck, looking back at the blue-green world they had reconstructed in the heart of the core. It was a perfect replica of the Earth, a monument to the cradle that had produced such a restless, indomitable species. They saw the oceans, the clouds, and the flickering lights of the cities they had preserved in memory. It was a small, fragile-looking thing, but they knew better than anyone that its beauty was matched only by its strength. The heavy worlders had climbed their way to the top of the universe, and now they were ready to see what lay on the other side. Vahn pulsed a final greeting to the archive, a signal of closure and respect. The great ring began to dim as the energy was diverted to the final transition. The stars of the second galaxy remained bright, a legacy for whoever might come after, but the consciousness of the assemblage was moving on. They were no longer defined by the gravity of their birth or the limitations of their biology. They were the momentum of the universe itself, a force of nature that had learned to love the dark because it was the canvas for their light. As the reality around them began to soften and blur into the harmonic resonance of the multiverse, Sura smiled. It was the same smile Vahn had seen on the faces of the humans in the Lunar Command Center and on the bridge of the Apex, a look of pure, unadulterated anticipation. The transition was a silent, golden flash that enveloped the great ring and the archive. In an instant, the last remnants of the old struggles, the old fears, and the old boundaries vanished. There was no pain, no loss, only a sudden, overwhelming sense of scale. They were everywhere and everyone, a collective mind that spanned the infinite. The humans had finally achieved their goal. They had reached the end of the climb and found that there was no summit, only an endless series of beautiful, challenging peaks. They were the climbers of the eternal, and the journey was just beginning. In the heart of the multiverse, the Golden Plate's message was finally complete. "We are here," it said, "and we are coming to meet you." The story of the terrestrials ended not with a period, but with an ellipsis. They were a species that refused to be a footnote in the history of the stars. They had taken a universe of silence and filled it with a roar that would never be extinguished. Vahn, now a part of that roar, felt a final flicker of wit as they looked back at the tiny, blue planet in the core. For a species that started out so small, they certainly knew how to make an entrance. The great archive was closed, the second galaxy was at peace, and the infinite was waiting. The weight of amber had been lifted, and in its place was the lightness of a new, eternal dawn.